Oh boy, baby reindeer. Let's go. As a comedian in the UK, I feel obliged to comment on any point my profession is spoken about in the public. And there's been no more public discussion of stand-up comedy than Baby Reindeer. Baby Reindeer was a show on Netflix that basically talked about a guy who was a stand-up comedian and his traumas through stand-up. And if you haven't watched the show, then click off this video because I'm going to be spoiling it loads. But if you have, I want you to stay because this is going to be crazy. Now, is Baby Reindeer accurate to what it's like to be a stand-up comedian in the UK? Shockingly, yes. Honestly, I've watched Game of Thrones, I've watched Breaking Bad, I've watched anime that would make your skin crawl, but I have never felt more uncomfortable than watching a grown man do a stand-up set in an empty pub, because it reminded me of all the times I've done it and watched other people do it. This scene is probably one of the most accurate depictions of what it's like to start off doing stand-up comedy. Because, for those of you who don't know, the way it starts with stand-up is there's a fly. For those of you who don't know, the way it starts with stand-up is you'll literally go to an open mic where there'll be people shouting to themselves in the corner of a room of a pub or some other public area. And then from there, you'll start doing your gigs and hopefully you'll move up to paid stuff, doing competitions and all that stuff. But unfortunately for the character in this show, who I think is named Donnie, even though he's named after and played by the creator of the show, Richard Gadd, don't really understand why they changed his name, but there you go. He is at a stage in his career where he's struggling to progress from the open mics and competition to actually paid stuff and doing pro nights. So he's in this situation now where he's just kind of treading water and he has no real progress. And because of the type of comedian he is, honestly, I also want to comment on this actually. The amount of comedians I've seen who are this exact person to a nutshell. Because in stand-up, you have so little tools at your disposal. It's just your microphone and your voice and your jokes and your words. But it means that essentially you have the situation where you have very little things to actually make jokes with. So you have a lot of people who become prop comedians and who rely on like PowerPoints and all that stuff. And I have nothing against those people. I'm like, more power to you, cool, these people can be hilarious. But it ends up being that there are a lot of people who aren't as good at that thing and end up using it as a crutch. And that's where Donnie finds himself. And you can see by the end of the show, he actually gets to a point where he stops relying on the props and all the gags and actually does stand-up. And I'm a purist. I love stand-up comedy so much, but I'm not a fan of props and all that stuff because I feel like it distills the actual art form, if you want to call it. So on that level, it's accurate. It's definitely accurate in its depiction of what it's like to be a stand-up comedian, particularly in the early years. Edinburgh was so accurate. The way that he's just there doing a gig in a place that doesn't really want him there, and the locals hate Edinburgh Fringe so much because it just ruins their town for a while. That is so relatable and so 100% accurate. But I think I would be remiss about talking about this show if I didn't actually talk about the genuine part about this that makes everyone watch it, and that's the trauma. Unfortunately, in British comedy, there are lots and lots of people who have very low self-esteem. It's the nature of comedians. We do this not because we want to make people laugh and happy. It's actually because we want to get this ego boost and feel fulfilled by a room full of people who are entertained by us. So that essentially means you select for a bunch of people who are unsure in themselves and sometimes kind of insecure. So it means you have a lot of people in the industry who are kind of willing to prey on that and are kind of willing to see people who could really use a boost in their confidence and use that as a way to control them, and in this case, kind of groom them. That is a definite part of stand-up comedy in the UK, and it's a sad part, and it actually doesn't shock me that a lot of this stuff is happening to Richard Gadd, and I really do believe his story. I mean, I guess the part that I find the confusing part is where he has this stalker person who's following him, who now has sued him and now is suing Netflix and has this crazy stuff going on. And I think that part of the show I kind of struggled to really reconcile with his previous traumas and what was the actual preceding incident. Like, I guess the idea is the reason why he's so predisposed to allowing someone to stalk him is because he's got this low self-esteem and because he's gone through this trauma. And yeah, I guess that makes sense. But it just shows how people who do stand-up are so willing to allow people to give them any form of attention, and that kind of environment breeds so much opportunity to be taken advantage of. And that's why you really have to be careful when you do this kind of career, because all we want to do is make people laugh to fill our egos. But if there's another way to fill our egos, we're gonna take it. But look, I'm not saying stand-up comedians are dumb at all. Stand-up comedians are some of the smartest, most streetwise people I've ever met. But when you're young and you're starting out, which I am now, I definitely resonate with a lot of the people who started with me being so vulnerable to this kind of thing. And I think it's unfortunate because, particularly in UK comedy, because there's not that much money at stake, like in America, for example, it means that there are a lot of opportunities that just aren't there like they are in the States. So it means there are so many more comedians than there are spots. So it means there are so many people fighting and scratching just to be noticed in any way, shape or form. And listen, man, it just breeds an environment where you have this situation where people just want to do something that they've always dreamt of doing. So anyone who even gives them a tiny taste of that will essentially have the keys to do whatever they want. I'd say the part, I guess, that was the least accurate, when Donnie was on stage doing his monologue to the audience, and he went on for like what must have been like 10, 20 minutes or whatever, talking about his traumas. It essentially, the way the audience reacted, I don't think is very authentic, because I feel like in a lot of places, if someone did that on stage, people would be furious. I've had people essentially cry on stage because the audience has been so unwilling to go with them on their like joke or their like sad soliloquy, because in a lot of places people just want to laugh and they can't be asked to deal with all this other stuff. And I completely empathize with the fact that he'd been through so much trauma, and this was finally a moment of catharsis for the character and a moment of catharsis for the show. But ultimately in real life this wouldn't happen. But it just honestly brought me back so much, to particularly my first year in starting stand-up, because I just remember being so clueless about what I was doing and who I was. Not that I figured that out necessarily now, but I at least know how to be funny in a way. And I think when you're still trying to figure out how to be funny, you feel so lost and like there's no direction, and you're constantly trying to clamber for ways to make this all make sense. And what am I going to do to make this work? How am I going to make money? How am I going to make this how am I going to make these pieces come together? And look, for me, I'm a doctor. I do stand-up comedy and I do medicine. It's the two things that I find the most interesting in the world. So I've always had a sense of direction with my medical career, but with comedy I just feel like there's no rules, there's no book to read that lets you figure out all this stuff. And that's why when I first started stand-up, I released a podcast where I used to interview comedians all the time, and I try to find out what it is that they do that makes it so that they were successful. And you can still listen to that podcast. It's called Oh Captain, My Captain. It's on Spotify. Check it out. But I think I did that mostly so that people who were coming after me had an instruction manual, because there just isn't one. And not having an instruction manual can lead to that sense of sort of meaningless walking around and going from gig to gig and not really feeling that sense of progression. But who knows, man, who knows? I think stand-up is such fascinating thing at the moment, because there's such a hunger for comedy and there's such a hunger for people who want to be comedians. But I think there's this weird situation where people are unwilling to put up with bad comedy. So that means people will only really go to comedy they know will be good. So if you're established and you're good and you will have an online following maybe, then mate, you have the keys to the world just at your disposal. But if you're someone who's just trying to get better and you're early starting out, it's hard to find gigs, man. It's hard to find stage time. It's hard to get to that point. So if you're someone who wants to try stand-up, I think don't let this show discourage you, but you need to know what you're getting into, and that the world of stand-up comedy, particularly in London of all places, is rough. And I think the one thing as well that I would say that they didn't depict very accurate is that in a lot of times when you're doing stand-up on new gigs, actually there won't be an audience. In fact, you'll just be performing to a room full of comedians. So at least Donnie in this show actually had an audience. But look, I don't even know if I've even managed to say anything about this show, but I think overall it was good. It was an interesting depiction of what it's like to be an insecure artist trying to figure out his way in the world, and how it can be very easily taken advantage of and manipulated. But at the same time, there's a lot of traumatic stuff, so you need to be careful when you watch this show. So that's all from me, guys. If you like my stuff, check out the podcast Sweet Lemons. It's on this page. Watch this video about the time I spoke to James Acaster and Jimmy Carr. But if not, I'll see you guys later. Check out my stand-up on Instagram. Bye-bye.